All right, let's dive into a genuine head-scratcher from the world of finance, the yield curve. You've probably noticed that the interest rate you'd get for a one-year loan is almost always different from a 30-year loan. But why? Why isn't it all the same? Today, we're going to put on our detective hats and piece together the clues to solve this very puzzle.
So let's just start with that big question right there. Why isn't there just one single interest rate for everything? It feels like the price of money should be, well, the price of money. But in the real world, the cost of borrowing, that interest rate, it changes, and sometimes it changes a lot, depending on the time. So what's going on here?
Okay, so our first major clue to solving this puzzle comes from a pretty radical idea. It basically suggests that the markets for short-term borrowing and long-term borrowing are like two completely different worlds that barely even know each other exist. This idea is called the market segmentation theory, and its core assumption is that, for an investor, a short-term bond and a long-term bond just aren't interchangeable. They're not substitutes. An investor who needs their cash back in a year, well, they're just not going to even consider locking it up for 30 years, no matter how sweet the interest rate is. It's like they're playing in totally different sandboxes.
And this really gets to the heart of it. You might think, well, investing for 2 years is easy. I'll just invest for 1 year, and then when that's done, I'll do it again. But this theory says, nope. Not the same thing, not even close. And why? Because of uncertainty. After that first year is up, you have absolutely no idea what the interest rate is going to be for your next investment. That risk makes them two fundamentally different things.
This analogy just illustrates the idea perfectly. According to this theory, comparing a one-year bond to a 30-year bond is like going shopping and comparing tomatoes to a high-end car. I mean, think about it. If you need tomatoes to make a sauce for dinner tonight, you're buying tomatoes. It doesn't matter if the Ferrari dealership down the street is having a 50% off sale. A Ferrari can't help you make dinner. It just doesn't meet your need. And in the same way, an investor with a short-term goal isn't going to be tempted by a long-term bond.
Okay, so that first theory was pretty rigid, right? Concrete walls between markets. So let's look at a slightly more flexible version. What if those walls aren't so high? What if they're more like, a fence that a really motivated investor could hop over if the prize on the other side was big enough?
And this brings us to what's called the preferred habitat theory. It's a really cool idea. It suggests that investors have a home base, a preferred time frame where they're most comfortable operating. A pension fund loves the long term. That's its natural habitat. But, and this is the crucial part, they can be lured out of that habitat if another market is offering a reward that's just too juicy to ignore. So let's put these two ideas side by side. Under market segmentation, the investor is 100% loyal to their time frame. End of story, they will not budge. But with the preferred habitat theory, that loyalty has a price. They might plan to spend their money in a year, but if a 10-year bond is offering some kind of incredible, once-in-a-lifetime interest rate, they might just be convinced to change their whole plan and wait. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. It all comes down to compensation. That interest rate prize has to be big enough to make an investor totally rethink their financial timeline. We're not talking about a small nudge here. It's got to be a massive incentive to pull them out of their comfort zone, out of their natural habitat.
All right, so we've got these two related theories on the table. So what? How do they actually help us explain those different shapes the yield curve can take? I mean, how do we get a curve that slopes up, or one that's totally flat, or even one that's bizarrely sloping down?
Well, this table breaks it down beautifully. It's all about good old supply and demand, but happening in each separate segmented market. A normal upward-sloping curve, that happens when there are way more people who want to borrow money long-term than there are people willing to save long-term. So to attract those savers, the long-term rates have to be higher. A flat curve? Simple. Supply and demand are pretty much balanced across the board. An inverted downward-sloping curve? That's a sign that there's intense, desperate demand for short-term cash, which pushes those short-term rates through the roof.
So here's the absolute key to this whole way of thinking. Because these markets are seen as separate, you can have these huge differences in interest rates, and they can just stay that way. A one-year bond could yield 1%, while a 30-year bond yields 5%, and you wouldn't see a giant flood of investors selling the 1% to buy the 5%. Why not? Because the theory assumes the people in the one-year market are there for a reason, and they aren't going to make that jump. There's no real arbitrage to even things out.
Now, this all sounds like a pretty great explanation, doesn't it? It feels like we've solved the puzzle. But, and you knew there was a but coming, when you hold this theory up against what happens in the real world, you start to see a crack. There's one crucial piece of evidence that just doesn't fit the picture.
And here it is. This is the big problem. When we actually look at the data, at decades of financial history, we see that interest rates for all the different time periods, short-term, medium-term, long-term, they almost always move together in the same direction, like they're all linked.
Let's be super clear why this is such a deal breaker. According to market segmentation, if, say, a whole bunch of people suddenly start saving for retirement, that's a huge new supply of long-term money. So that should push only the long-term interest rates down. The short-term market, it's a separate world. It shouldn't even notice. But that's not what happens. In reality, when rates move, the entire curve tends to shift up or down together.
And so, this leaves us with our final, really provocative question. If these markets are truly as separate as tomatoes and cars, why on earth do their prices almost always move in lockstep? This single observation suggests there has to be a much stronger connection between them than either of these theories can really explain. And that, well, that opens the door for a whole new set of clues.